At 58, Michael had the conversation he'd been rehearsing for months. He sat across from his boss at the consulting firm where he'd worked for 23 years and explained that he was ready to retire. The firm was offering an early retirement package to senior partners, not generous by industry standards, but combined with his savings and the pension he'd been accruing, the numbers worked. His financial advisor had run the projections multiple times. They showed he could maintain his lifestyle, travel more, finally have time for the photography and hiking he'd been deferring. His wife, Sarah, who'd retired from teaching 2 years earlier at 59, encouraged the decision. They'd have time together. They'd avoid the health issues and burnout they'd watched colleagues experience by working into their late 60s. Early retirement felt like winning, leaving on their terms, while they still had health and energy, with enough resources to enjoy decades of freedom. That was 11 years ago. Now, at 69, Michael understood that almost everything about how he'd thought about early retirement had been misleading in ways he couldn't have recognized at 58. This pattern, the gap between how early retirement appears in prospect and how it unfolds across a decade or more of actual experience, shows up consistently among people who retire before the conventional age of 65. The decision often makes sense based on the information available at the time: adequate savings, promising projections, desire for freedom, health concerns, or favorable circumstances like buyout packages. But early retirement carries implications that only reveal themselves across years of living it. Implications about longevity risk, identity erosion, purpose generation, social isolation, and financial psychology that planning can identify intellectually, but that can't be fully understood until experienced. Understanding why early retirement can be misleading matters not because it's the wrong choice, but because the actual experience differs substantially from how it's imagined, and that difference shapes a potentially very long retirement phase. Michael and Sarah had approached the decision carefully. They'd worked with a financial advisor who specialized in early retirement scenarios. Michael had his 401k, which had grown to just over $800,000. The pension from his firm would provide about $3,200 monthly. Sarah's teacher's pension added another $2,200. They wouldn't claim Social Security for several years, but when they did, their combined benefits would add another $4,500 monthly. The advisor projected they could withdraw 4% annually from the 401k, which would provide an additional $32,000 per year. Combined with the pensions, they'd have roughly $90,000 annually before Social Security, and over $140,000 once they claimed benefits. Their house was paid off. Their children were independent. The advisor acknowledged they'd be living in what's called the retirement risk zone, the vulnerable period when you're taking withdrawals but haven't yet claimed Social Security. But he said the numbers held up even in adverse scenarios. The first 5 years seemed to validate the decision completely. Michael experienced profound relief from leaving work. The final years at the consulting firm had been increasingly stressful, younger partners pushing for changes, clients demanding more for less, technology transforming the industry in ways that made his expertise feel less relevant. Retirement brought immediate psychological benefits. He slept better. His blood pressure, which had been creeping up, came back down. He and Sarah traveled, not extravagantly, but meaningfully. They spent a month in France, hiked portions of the Appalachian Trail, visited their daughter who'd relocated to Seattle. Michael pursued photography seriously, taking workshops, building a portfolio, entering competitions. Sarah gardened, took ceramics classes, volunteered with literacy programs. They spent more time with their 2 grandchildren, providing childcare that helped their son and daughter-in-law manage demanding careers. When friends asked about early retirement, Michael's answer was unequivocal: best decision he'd ever made. But around year 6, subtle realities began emerging that the projections hadn't captured. The first was financial, but not in the way Michael had anticipated. Their spending had stayed within the budget. They weren't overspending or making irresponsible choices. But the portfolio that had been growing when he retired had now been declining for 6 years through regular withdrawals. They'd lived through a significant market correction in year 4 that had temporarily reduced the balance by nearly 20%. It recovered partially, but the combination of withdrawals and market volatility meant the 401k that had been $100,000 at retirement was now closer to $650,000. They were 64 and 65. If they lived to 90, they had potentially 25 more years to fund. The 4% withdrawal rate that had seemed conservative at 58 felt less comfortable at 64, when applied to a smaller base over a longer projected timeline. What made this particularly concerning was something the advisor had mentioned, but that Michael hadn't fully grasped: sequence of returns risk. Because they'd retired early and started withdrawals before their portfolio had benefited from additional accumulation years, they were vulnerable to market timing in ways that wouldn't have affected them if they'd worked longer. The market downturn in year 4 had forced them to sell shares at depressed prices to fund their lifestyle, locking in losses they couldn't offset with new contributions. Someone retiring at 65 with additional years of contributions and growth would have weathered the same downturn differently. Michael was learning that early retirement meant carrying portfolio risk for a longer duration, with less accumulation buffer and more distribution pressure. The second reality emerged more gradually and was harder to quantify. Michael's sense of purpose, which had felt so clear in the early years, finally having time for photography, travel, family, had begun to erode as those activities lost their novelty and revealed their limitations. Photography remained enjoyable but had proven insufficient as a comprehensive source of meaning. He'd built the portfolio he'd envisioned. He'd won a few regional competitions, but then what? It was a hobby, not a career. It didn't provide the structure, identity, or sense of contribution that work had offered for 4 decades. And the challenge of finding sustainable purpose had intensified because he'd been retired for 11 years now, with potentially another 20 ahead. The question wasn't what to do for a few years of well-earned leisure. It was what to do with what might be a third of his total lifespan. Sarah had experienced something similar with her volunteer work and ceramics. The activities that had seemed so compelling initially had either plateaued or proven unsustainable. She was 67 now, having been retired for 13 years. She'd been retired almost as long as she'd taught. The identity of retired teacher that had felt adequate initially had faded. She was just retired now, which felt more like absence than presence. Absence of role, absence of professional purpose, absence of structure that came from external demands rather than self-generated decisions about how to fill days. This pattern appears consistently in early retirement experiences. The activities and purpose that sustain engagement for 2 or 3 years often prove insufficient for 10 or 15 or 20. Early retirement means needing to solve the purpose question not just once, but repeatedly, across what becomes a very long phase of life, to fill meaningfully without the framework that work provided. People who retire at 65 face this challenge too, but for potentially 15 years rather than 25. Early retirement extends the duration of the challenge, while also removing it further from the professional identity and capabilities that might inform solutions. Social dimension revealed its own misleading aspects. Michael had maintained friendships from his consulting years, and initially they'd stayed connected through occasional lunches and golf outings. But as years passed, those friendships had attenuated faster than he'd expected. His former colleagues were still working, still embedded in professional networks and shared contexts. Michael's life had diverged. Their conversations increasingly felt strained. They discussed projects he knew nothing about, people he no longer knew, industry developments he'd stopped following. By year 8, the invitations had largely stopped, not through hostility but through natural drift. He'd left the professional ecosystem early, and the ecosystem had continued without him. Sarah had experienced similar social contraction. The teaching friendships had weakened as she'd been out of the schools for over a decade. The newer teachers didn't know her. The colleagues from her era had either retired themselves and faced similar social challenges, or were still working and occupied with their own professional lives. The volunteer work had provided some social connection, but it was thinner, less deep than professional relationships built over decades of shared work. There's a framework that helps explain why early retirement can be misleading despite careful planning. Think of retirement as having 2 distinct challenges: the logistics and the lived experience. Logistics include finances, healthcare, location, activities, things that can be projected, calculated, and planned. Early retirement planning focuses almost exclusively on logistics, and it's possible to get the logistics mostly right. Lived experience includes purpose, identity, social connection, psychological relationship to money and time. and sense of self across decades without professional role. These can't be planned in the same way, because they emerge through living rather than through projecting. And early retirement extends the duration of the lived experience challenge, while making it harder to solve because you're younger when you exit professional life, further from natural retirement age, and facing a longer period to fill meaningfully. The mortality awareness that Michael experienced around year 9 added another layer he hadn't anticipated. Several friends and former colleagues had died, some suddenly, some after extended illness. Michael had attended enough funerals to start calculating his own actuarial probabilities differently. If he lived to 85, he had 16 more years. Some of those years would likely involve health issues, reduced capability, potentially long-term care. Early retirement had seemed like a way to maximize healthy, active years, but it had also meant he'd been consuming financial resources for over a decade before reaching the conventional retirement age. And he was beginning to recognize that the later years might require more resources than the early years while coinciding with depleted savings. This manifested most acutely when Michael's father, who was 91, moved into memory care. The costs were staggering, $9,200 monthly. His father's resources covered perhaps 2 years at that rate. After that, Michael and his sister would likely need to contribute. Michael could manage his share, but it would require reducing their own discretionary spending and potentially adjusting their withdrawal rate. More troubling was the implication. If Michael lived to 91 and needed similar care, would his resources, already diminished by 11 years of early retirement withdrawals, cover it? The financial advisor's projections had included long-term care estimates, but the reality felt more concrete and more expensive than spreadsheet scenarios suggested. What people who experience a decade or more of early retirement consistently report is that the misleading aspect isn't that the numbers were wrong, but that numbers can't capture the psychological, social, and existential dimensions of spending what might be 20 or 30 years outside professional life. Early retirement looks like freedom and success from the perspective of someone still working. From inside a decade of it, it reveals challenges around purpose, identity, social isolation, financial anxiety despite adequacy, and the recognition that you have potentially a very long time to fill meaningfully with diminishing resources and energy. For Michael, the adjustment came through a combination of practical changes and psychological recalibration. Around year 10, he took on consulting work, not full-time, but perhaps 15 hours a week helping smaller firms with projects that needed his specific expertise. The income was modest but welcome. More importantly, it provided structure, professional engagement, and renewed sense of competence. It also meant less time in undefined retirement, which paradoxically made retirement more sustainable by reducing the burden of filling every day with self-generated meaning. Sarah found her version through a different path. She started teaching again, but part-time and in a different context. Adult education classes at the community college, 2 courses per semester on topics she enjoyed. It wasn't career re-engagement, but it was professional adjacent activity that used her skills and provided more structure and purpose than volunteer work had offered. By year 11, they'd both recognized that pure early retirement, complete exit from professional or structured activity, wasn't sustainable for them across what might be a 30-year span. They'd needed some version of continued engagement, though much reduced from full-time careers, to make the long phase feel purposeful, rather than simply time-filling. The consulting and teaching provided that, though it also meant acknowledging that the early retirement they'd imagined, complete freedom from work obligations, hadn't proven as satisfying as they'd expected. The financial picture had also led to adjustments. They'd become more conservative in spending, not because they were running out of money, but because the psychology of watching the portfolio shrink over 11 years while facing potentially 20% more had created anxiety that adequate balances didn't eliminate. They'd decided to claim Social Security earlier than originally planned, not for financial necessity, but for the psychological comfort of having more guaranteed income and less dependence on portfolio withdrawals. This reduced their lifetime Social Security benefits, but provided peace of mind that felt worth the trade-off. What Michael would tell someone considering early retirement now, based on 11 years of experience, is that the decision isn't simply about whether the numbers work, but about whether you can sustain purpose, identity, and engagement across what might be a very long phase without professional structure. Early retirement works best for people who either have genuinely compelling non-work passions that can sustain decades of engagement, or who are comfortable with some form of continued professional or structured activity that provides meaning without full-time obligation. Pure early retirement, complete exit from all professional engagement into undefined leisure, proves misleading for many people because 2 or 3 years of sustainable activities don't automatically extend to 20 or 25 years, and because the psychological challenges of extended time without structure reveal themselves only through living it. These discoveries happen quietly over years, in photography studios that get used less over time, in volunteer positions that lose their meaning, in friendships that fade as professional contexts diverge, in portfolio balances that shrink despite careful planning, in days that feel simultaneously long and forgettable, in the recognition that you've been retired longer than you imagined possible, and still have a potentially very long time ahead. Early retirement can be misleading, not because it's wrong, but because it's imagined from the perspective of someone still working, who naturally emphasizes freedom and relief, while underestimating the challenges of purpose generation, identity maintenance, social connection, and meaning-making across what becomes a substantial portion of total lifespan. The numbers matter, certainly, but what matters more, and what can't be projected or planned with the same precision, is whether you can actually create a fulfilling life across 20 or 30 years without the structure, identity, and purpose that professional work provided through most of your adult existence.